There is an entire continent you are not allowed to visit, and the reason they give you doesn't hold up. Scientists go, militaries go, billionaires with private expeditions go. But the treaties and no-fly zones keeping ordinary people out don't read like conservation policy. They read like something is being guarded. So, what exactly are they protecting down there? Let's start with what they actually put on paper, because the document itself is where the story gets weird. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959 by 12 nations. On its face, it sounds like a perfectly reasonable agreement. No military bases, no weapons testing, no resource extraction. The continent is for science only. Clean, logical. The kind of thing you'd point to and say, see, the grown-ups handled it. And for a long time, that's exactly how it was sold to the public. But here's what I kept coming back to when I looked into this. The treaty bans military activity, and yet the United States, Russia, and China all maintain what can only be described as military-adjacent infrastructure down there right now, in 2026. They call it logistical support. They call it research station operations. Ask yourself, though, how much logistical muscle does a scientific outpost actually need? Because what's been documented isn't a few snowmobiles and a satellite dish. It's the kind of operational footprint that raises a very specific question. Why does a frozen research preserve need that level of presence? The treaty says one thing. The infrastructure says something else entirely. Then there are the no-fly zones. And this is the part that doesn't get talked about enough. There are specific corridors of restricted airspace over Antarctica that go well beyond anything a conservation or scientific zone would require. Independent pilots, not military, not government, who have drifted towards certain areas report being turned away, actively redirected. In a place that is supposedly open to peaceful scientific inquiry, somebody is very interested in controlling what flies over it and where. Now drop back to 1946. Operation High Jump. The United States Navy assembled a full military task force, warships, an aircraft carrier, submarines, aircraft, and sent it to Antarctica. The official explanation was cold weather training for troops. That was the story. I'm not going to tell you that's impossible, but I am going to tell you what happened next. The mission was cut short. It was supposed to run significantly longer. Admiral Richard Byrd came back early. The detailed findings were classified, and Byrd gave one interview, a single, strange interview, where he described encountering something unexpected. He was not specific. He was never allowed to be specific again in any public forum. And then the whole thing went quiet. I want to be clear about my position here. I'm not saying I know what High Jump found. I'm saying the official explanation for that mission has never been satisfying. Cold weather training does not require an aircraft carrier. It does not require submarines, and it does not end early with classified findings and a cryptic interview from the commanding officer. What I find genuinely unsettling isn't any single one of these details. It's the pattern. Official reason, strange behavior, early termination, classification. That sequence shows up every time a major power sends serious assets to Antarctica. The treaty that was supposed to make everything transparent keeps producing outcomes that aren't transparent at all. And the nations signing that treaty aren't small players hedging their bets. They're the same governments that have spent decades expanding their presence on a continent they officially agreed to leave alone. That pattern is the thread worth pulling, because once you start looking at what those governments might actually be protecting, what's underneath the ice rather than on top of it, the scientific preserve framing starts to feel less like an explanation and more like a curtain. Does Operation High Jump's early cut short ending feel like a cover-up to you, or do you buy the cold weather training explanation? Drop your answer in the comments below, because what happened after that mission is where this gets even harder to dismiss. Lake Vostok's existence as a liquid body of water buried beneath the Antarctic ice was definitively confirmed in 1996, and what followed is one of the most quietly unsettling episodes in modern science. Russia's Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute drilled through to the lake, nearly 4 kilometers of ice, and finally broke through in February 2012. Think about what that actually means. A freshwater lake the size of Lake Ontario, completely sealed from the atmosphere for somewhere between 15 and 20 million years, sitting in the total darkness under crushing pressure. That is one of the most extraordinary environments ever accessed by human beings. So, what did they find? Here's where it gets quiet in a way that shouldn't be quiet. Scientists identified an unknown bacterium with no matches in any international database, and then the whole thing dissolved into a contamination argument. The Russian team used kerosene drilling fluid that was contaminated by surface bacteria, which prevented scientists from having reliable data about organisms in the lake, and the Russians would not agree to follow a sterile protocol. So the one time you break through to a 20-million-year-old sealed ecosystem, you do it dirty, on purpose. And then the results from a later clean probe were unreported. In any other scientific context, a new species, a new planet, a new chemical compound, the findings would be published, debated, celebrated, torn apart by peer review. The silence coming out of Vostok isn't the silence of nothing was there. It reads like the silence of something that got quietly managed. Then there's the Nazi angle, and I know how that sounds. But stay with me, because this one has documentation behind it. Germany ran an expedition to Antarctica in 1938 and 1939, the Neuschwabenland expedition, and formally claimed a section of the continent. Post-war theories emerged that a hidden base had been established there. Those theories were never fully confirmed. But here's what I find more interesting than the theories themselves. Multiple governments treated the possibility seriously enough to investigate. You don't send naval task forces to chase a rumor you've already dismissed. The fact that the investigation happened is its own data point, regardless of what it found. And then there's the flat Earth ice wall theory, which I'm not going to pretend deserves the same weight. But I do think it's worth understanding why it spread. When people sense that access to a place is being controlled, and the official explanation doesn't fully account for the control, they fill the vacuum. The ice wall stuff is the vacuum getting filled. My take. The flat Earth framing is a distraction, and it's a useful one for anyone who wants the real questions buried next to the embarrassing ones. But the instinct underneath it, that something is being hidden, isn't crazy. It's a reasonable response to a pattern of restricted access that the scientific preserve explanation has never fully justified. As of right now, in 2026, the competition for Antarctic positioning has become unmistakable. In March 2025, China announced plans to build its sixth Antarctic station, its sixth. Russia, meanwhile, is reopening and upgrading stations and building a new runway. China has plans to outfit its newer sites with satellite antennas that analysts note can be used for both civilian research and military and intelligence purposes. While the Antarctic Treaty bans new territorial claims, China's expanding infrastructure suggests it is positioning itself for future negotiations should the treaty ever be renegotiated or challenged. That is not the behavior of a country interested in penguin populations. That is the behavior of a country staking a position before the rules change. Here is my actual verdict. Not a theory, just the conclusion the evidence points to. The most credible explanation isn't one single buried secret. It's that Antarctica sits on top of something worth controlling, subglacial resources, strategic positioning, and possibly anomalies that no government has been willing to fully disclose because disclosure means negotiation, and negotiation means sharing. Some experts posit that major powers are developing capabilities in anticipation of the Antarctic Treaty's potential 2048 renegotiation. And since the treaty currently has no enforcement mechanism, activities that push the boundaries could open the floodgates for others to follow. The treaty isn't protecting the ice. It's managing the competition happening underneath it, keeping it civil, keeping it quiet, and keeping the rest of us out while that competition plays out. That's the real reason it's off limits, not conservation, not science, control, and the race to be in the best position when the gentleman's agreement finally expires. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling threads like this.